Hi, everyone. Welcome to our campus climate dialogue. This one's focused on sustainable food systems and the climate crisis. We're excited to have participants here from all over Washington and a widespread representation from higher education institutions. We're your hosts today. My name is Stefan Masao-Clausen. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the Assistant Director of Sustainable Practices at Cascadia College. And with me today is Alexa Russo, the Sustainability Coordinator for UW Bothell. Climate change will affect us all, and food is something that everyone needs. How we impact climate change with our choices and how our food is being affected is the focus today. It's an environmental issue, an economic issue, and primarily a social injustice issue. We have 3 speakers on various topics for you today, followed by a Q&A and then a breakout session for guided discussions around climate and food. Participants are going to be muted until the breakout rooms, so you'll have a chance to ask questions after the speakers. Following these breakout discussions, we'll also have a Jamboard for you on sustainable food systems, and we'll have a survey for you to compare knowledge from the event and help offer ideas for continued climate learning and engagement. Before we get started, the University of Washington, Bothell and Cascadia College want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land we are on, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We recognize that this is a difficult, painful, and long history, and we thank the original caretakers of this land. We're grateful to respectfully live and work as guests on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. This land acknowledgement is only one small act of the ongoing process of working to be in good relationship with the land and the people of the land. We thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial, and we recognize the challenges of attending this event digitally during the global pandemic. Wherever you may be, one of the first steps one can take is to learn more about what land one rests upon. An imperfect yet starting resource we'll share in the chat later is native-land.ca, where you can use this to begin your own self-education about your area. With that, our first speaker is Dr. David Montgomery, who is a professor of Earth and Space Sciences at the University of Washington.
Oh, Stefan, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen here, and I will get started. I'm a geologist, and so I look at climate from my own sort of perspective, and that's been for the last 10 years or so one focused on soils. And so I'm going to give you basically an overview of these 3 books that I've written: Dirt, The Hidden Half of Nature, and Growing a Revolution. And middle one I co-authored with my wife, who's a biologist. And I'm trying to illustrate to you why I look at soils as not just the critical sort of agricultural foundation of human civilizations, but also a tool for us in trying to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change. If you want to follow up with questions, my contact info is there at the bottom, but let me get right into it. I'm concerned about the problem of soil degradation because it's a global problem. This is the UN's map of soil degradation that shows an awful lot of that orange and red colors on the map. There's a lot of degraded soils in the world. And I like to use this slide to start with because it allows me to say that it's a global problem, but it also allows me to forecast that while you may be very depressed looking at a map like this, you can go into each of those red zones on the map and find places where farms are actively turning around the problem of soil degradation and building healthy, fertile soils. So the first part of this talk may be a little depressing, and I'll get to the optimistic part in the second part. But we're losing about 0.3% of our ability to feed ourselves globally each and every year to ongoing soil erosion and degradation. And you can add that on top to the projected 1%, the 10% decrease in crop yields that are projected to accompany each 1 degree Celsius increase in global average temperatures. It suggests that we may have a problem agriculturally later on this century if we continue with on a climate trajectory and if we continue degrading the world's farmlands. This is an issue that I wrote about some 10, 15 years ago in Dirt, when I started looking into the problem of global land degradation and the effect of human societies on the land, but also how that degradation affected human societies. And what I basically uncovered in researching that book is that there's a long history of connecting soil erosion and degradation to the demise of ancient civilizations. You can take it all the way back to Bronze Age Europe, classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, Central America, and other societies around the world. I'll spare you the litany today of all those places. They're obviously sort of gone through in the book, but there's basically a common theme to the humanity's agricultural experience in different regions of the world. And that is, after the adoption of plow-based agriculture, soil degradation of the type that I just highlighted really set in different regions around the world. And it was the invention of the plow that fundamentally altered the balance between the pace of soil production and the pace of soil loss or soil erosion that has helped contribute to the demise of civilizations around the world. What is it about the plow that makes soils vulnerable to both the loss of the soil and the loss of soil organic matter, soil carbon, as I'll get into in a minute? It's that it leaves the ground bare and vulnerable to erosion by water or by wind. And nature tends to build soils slowly, and plowed agricultural fields can actually erode much faster than nature can rebuild the damage. What's that pace? Well, that's something I looked into in researching dirt, and this slide summarizes the data from some 1,400 studies that I compiled on how fast are the world's agricultural lands eroding under modern conventional farming practices. And the number I came up with as a global average is that red number up there on the screen, about 1.5 millimeters a year. At that pace, it takes about 20 years to erode off an inch of fertile topsoil. Well, how fast does nature actually rebuild soils? Well, I also compiled data from around the world on that, and that's that blue number down below. Soils naturally build at a pace of about 2% of a millimeter a year. It's really hard to measure something that happens that slowly. But it is, and it takes, at that pace, it takes about 1,000 years to actually replace that inch of topsoil that modern farming practices can remove in just a few decades. Therein lies the problem that has plagued both past societies and that threatens the sustainability of our modern global agricultural civilization. That red number is a couple orders of magnitude larger than that blue number, which basically means that we're mining the world's supply of fertile topsoil to feed ourselves. And that's a situation that can't be sustained forever for obvious reasons. And it's also something that has had a great impact in the past. The numbers I just shared with you, you can calculate in the back of a napkin what you would predict to be the longevity of an agricultural civilization from that. And that net loss of soil of about 1 millimeter a year implies that you could lose a typical 0.5 meter to 1 meter thick, a 1.5 foot to a 3 foot thick hill slope soil in about 500 to 1,000 years. And if you go back and look through the history of agricultural civilizations, as I did in writing dirt, you'll basically find that that's about the average longevity of most major civilizations outside of major river floodplains. What is it about big river floodplains that allow agricultural societies to persist for longer? Well, think about the Tigris and the Euphrates in the Near East. Think about the Nile in Egypt, the big rivers of the Indus and the Brahmaputra in India, or the big rivers, alluvial rivers of lowland China. Those are all big river floodplains where floods annually deposit a layer of silt or sand on the land, and that can rebuild and replace the soil that's lost from agricultural soil erosion. How thick is a typical grain of sand? Well, it's about 0.5 millimeter to 2 millimeters is sort of the range of sizes for sand grains. In other words, an annual flood that laid down just a single grain of sand would be at a pace that's capable of retarding agricultural soil loss. And that's why civilizations have been able to thrive for thousands of years in resilient environments on major river floodplains. But the clock starts ticking when we start farming outside of valley bottoms, offside of major river floodplains. But that's not the only aspect of soil that's been degraded. And the one that relates more directly to climate, although I should note that roughly about by the 1980s, roughly about 1/3 of the CO2 that had been added to the atmosphere after the Industrial Revolution actually came from the degradation of soil organic matter from plowing up the Great Plains of North America and Eastern Europe and parts of the Loess Plateau in China. And the degradation of soil organic matter in North American soils has been roughly about 50%, according to estimates that have been made, like the one that's shown up here on the screen now, where roughly about half of the soil organic matter originally held in our farmland soils has been degraded and liberated back to the atmosphere over the course of the past century and a half of modern conventional agriculture. What does that look like on the ground? Well, these are two soils collected from literally across a fence row in North Carolina. The one on the right-hand side of the screen, the khaki one, is from a tobacco plantation that's been worked conventionally with intensive tillage and fertilizers for 100 years. And the one on the left is from the forest immediately over the fence line. Notice the color difference. You can notice that the pine needles and all that kind of stuff too, but just notice the basic color difference. That's due to soil organic matter. This is from the same geologic parent material in the same climate, the same soil type. The difference is how they've been farmed, how they've been managed for the last century. And that the organic matter content in the soil on the left-hand side of the screen is probably about 4 to 5 or 6%. On the right-hand side of the screen, it's less than 1%. That loss of soil organic matter is a big deal on agricultural lands, because if you look at the total amount of carbon stored in the world's soils, it's twice what's in the atmosphere. Soils are a huge reservoir for carbon. So of course, this motivates the question of, is soil restoration possible? Could we reverse the historical pattern of land degradation? And that's what Ann and I wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature, which is the book where we wrote about our experience rebuilding the fertility of the soil in our own yard. And when we bought a house in North Seattle and we stripped off the lawn that was in the side yard, we discovered we had soil that looked a lot like this, khaki, less than 1% organic matter. It was not the kind of soil that my biologist gardener wife really wanted to have in the yard. So she started composting and mulching and compost and mulching and putting wood chips down everywhere and coffee grounds and zoo doo from the Seattle Zoo, which is exactly what it sounds like it was. She added organic matter to the soil because we had the mineral part of soil, but we didn't have the organic matter. We didn't have the life in the soil. And this slide shows you what she was able to do with about 10 years of composting and mulching. Turned our originally 1% organic matter content soil into something that's closer to 10%, raising it by about 1% a year. And it's one thing to be able to do that in a urban garden where you have access to coffee shops and the Seattle Zoo and our neighbor's oak leaves and all kinds of organic matter sources in an urban environment to restore fertility to land like that. But if you sort of run the numbers, if we could take North American or global farmland and take it back from 1 or 2% organic matter up to 3, 4% or higher, it can actually take a substantial bite out of current global emissions, carbon emissions, that is. So I basically wanted to ask the question of, well, could we do this on working farms? And so I took 6 months and traveled around the world to interview farmers who had done to their farms what Ann had done to our yard, converting khaki colored or carbon poor soils like this on the left into organic matter rich soils like that on the right. And what I found was that the farmers who adopted the principles of conservation agriculture, which involve minimal or no disturbance, so not plowing, going to no-till farming, maintaining a permanent ground cover through cover crops that actually can help feed the microbes in the soil that build soil organic matter, and planting a diversity of crops, rotating crops, at least 3 or 4 or more crops in a rotation, instead of growing monocultures or functional monocultures like a corn and soybean rotation. That these were recipes for restoring life to the soil and building soil organic matter. And these are not coincidentally virtually the opposite of what we've been teaching in agronomy for the last 100 years, when we've stressed intensive tillage, intensive agrochemical and fertilizer use, and specializing in growing 1 or 2 crops, fairly simplified crop rotations. What did this do to the soil of the farmers that I visited? This shows you an example from David Brandt's farm in Carroll, Ohio. It's the Cardington clay soil. So it's a heavy clay soil. The soil here on the right, the khaki stuff, that's what he started with back in 1971 when he first started no-till farming. And he eventually developed a system that embraced cover crops and then a diversity of crops. He sells wheat, corn, and soybeans into the North American commodity crop markets, but that's not all he grows. He grows very diverse mixtures of cover crops between his cash crops. And what that's done is turned this khaki colored soil into the rich soil he has today on the left. He's actually increased the soil organic matter content of his soil to higher than that of the native soils in the area that he's in. It's been a huge change to the soils. The other farmer that I'll show you here is a gentleman named Gabe Brown. He's a rancher and farmer in Bismarck, North Dakota. The soil on his most intensively worked piece of ground is shown here with this rich black chocolate cake kind of a consistency. His neighbor's organic farm is down here. It's a lighter brown and khaki color. And again, the difference is carbon. The difference between about a 3 or 4% and something that's much higher on the left is due to his adopting these regenerative farming practices that build soil organic matter. And this is a graph that I've borrowed from Gabe's TED Talk, basically shows you the changes in soil organic matter. And remember that soil organic matter is 50% carbon, roughly 40 to 50%. He started out with less than 2% organic matter. By 2010, in less than 20 years, he'd tripled it to about 6% organic matter. The field, the rich black soil I just showed you from his one special field that he really got special attention on, he's gotten it up over 10%. In other words, he's done to his farm, his ranch, what Ann did to our yard in terms of really increasing the amount of soil organic matter. He tripled it in just 2 decades. So these are all examples of how to reverse the problem of soil degradation. And I think there's many reasons why we would choose to do so as a society, as an individual farmer or landowner, as a society, and as a civilization. It can result in higher farmer profits. This is very motivational for many farmers. And why is that? It's because restoring fertility of the soil can actually produce comparable yields to agrochemical intensive agriculture, but it relies on less fertilizer, less pesticide, and less diesel. It uses less fossil fuel. That translates into a lower cost for farmers with comparable yields. They harvest roughly similar income. The bigger spread on that translates into higher profits. But in terms of connecting to climate, those changes in the colors of the soils I was showing are really where the connection is. Well, also in using less fertilizer and fossil fuels will reduce agricultural emissions, but we can also store carbon in the ground by increasing soil organic matter. It doesn't stay there forever, but if you think of it as a reservoir that can be dynamically and actively maintained, tripling or quadrupling the amount of carbon in our agricultural soils, as the farmers that I just showed you did, is a recipe for actually helping out with the global climate problem in terms of both adaptation and resilience of farms, but also in terms of our carbon budget. And I will stop there, and hopefully I haven't gone too far over my time. Naturally, I'll encourage everybody, if you're interested, to check out these books. They should be available in any library or any place that you normally would get books. And if you want to contact me to ask questions about them, feel free to get in touch at the addresses below. And I will basically turn it back over to the general proceedings.
Thank you, David. That was really interesting. I mean, I think we've seen a bit of it, knowledge going recently about like soil importance. And so we're really happy you covered this in a sense. Our next speaker is Anthony Reyes, who is the farm operations lead from 21 Acres. It's a sustainably minded agriculture and education center in Woodinville, Washington. They're one of our favorite partners, and hopefully you all get to visit and see it sometime. So Anthony, go ahead.
Okay. All right, I'm just going to share my screen here really quick. And let's see here. Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me there, or having me out here. And it was really interesting to hear, David, what you were talking about. We're actually seeing a lot of the same things with our farm right now. We run a pretty intensive cover cropping system. Actually, our biggest challenge is being able to maintain or deal with the crop residue once we mow it down, or we're doing a whole bunch of different experiments. But when I had started, we had about 6 feet tall of all invasive noxious weeds on site. So we're sort of in the process of getting our farm back into productivity and back into a sort of a regenerative space. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about local agriculture, sustainable food, and regenerative agriculture. For a little bit of history over myself, like I'm the farm operations lead out here at 21 Acres. We do a lot in environmental education with the key mission of trying to inspire action around climate, or inspire climate action. And so we do a lot of education, and COVID is sort of providing us an opportunity to step back and identify how we're going to be moving forward with a lot of this more farm-based education. Prior to 21 Acres, my history is working. I worked with Homeless Garden Project in Santa Cruz, which is an employment transition program for people experiencing homelessness. And then prior to that, I was in Seattle working with Seattle Tilth, managing 2 of their urban farms, and also managing the Seattle Youth Garden Works program there, which was employment transition program for young people experiencing homelessness. So my focus is going to be a lot more on the social aspect of climate change and the social aspect of the food system, and looking at some of the responses that we're talking about, and sort of also interrogating some of the shortcomings and shortfalls of those, and proposing some new means of moving forward, and new means of thinking about how we're moving forward collectively. So this is a picture of 21 Acres. We have a nice view of Mount Rainier, and we're actually right next to Viva Farms as well, which is the farm incubator site. And so that's Viva Farms right behind there. So I wanted to start by just providing a few definitions that we'll be talking through. And I wanted to position it in this way because I see it as sort of a gradient scale. Organic agriculture, there's big O and there's little o. When we're talking about big O, we're talking about the very specific policy that's involved with the National Organic Program. And you actually have to have a certification to be calling your farm big O organic. But that's basically just farming without the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. Doesn't have anything about labor, doesn't have anything about really anything other than synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. They've actually recently started going more into and requiring crop rotations and more in biodiversity and how you're creating systems on your farm that are increasing biodiversity. Second term, just really brief go over, is sustainable ag. And it's an approach to agriculture that's really following that triple bottom line, those three tenets of ecologically sound, economically viable, and socially just. Typically, when I'm actually looking at and analyzing a lot of these sustainable agriculture procedures or processes in farms, I find that they might be really strong in one of those three areas or two of those three areas. And the one that's really lacking is really how are we establishing a socially just food system? Next one, regenerative ag. This is one that I just pulled off of the Regeneration International. But Bothell Institute, they have pages and pages and pages on defining regenerative agriculture, and it's also starting to become a certification as well. But regenerative agriculture is farming and grazing practices that are actively trying to reverse the effects of climate change, draw down a lot more carbon, increase soil organic matter and biodiversity, and just sort of create more resilient systems through our agricultural practices. And this last one, this is where my school of thought is, and I apologize, I'm sort of running away from the sun as it's coming through the window. But agroecology, this is what my practices are really rooted in. And it's the integration of ecology and agriculture and food systems, encompassing ecological, economic, and social dimensions, which I'm going to break that down a lot more because it can seem like a really simple topic and really simple idea, but it becomes vastly complex and vastly more complicated as you start breaking down what are the ecological processes that are present in a food system. And that's a really important distinction between that step of agroecology, incorporating the food system into a lot of its means of thinking, that expanded how they're thinking about processes moving forward, and how they're thinking about really addressing some of these larger systemic challenges and systemic issues. So I'll briefly just go over what does regenerative agriculture system look like. And one thing that helps me in thinking about a regenerative system is understanding what is a generative system. And for me, a generative system would be just like nature, sort of undisturbed land. I always see that as a generative system. So then when we're talking about regenerative system, that's implying that it is in direct response to a lot of these degenerative industrial agricultural practices. So that's a lot of like when we're thinking about the green revolutions, the invention of hybridization, the incorporation of all of the mass mechanization, and really even that following of this energy in, energy out model of agriculture, rather than focusing on what are we doing to replenish the soil and what are we doing to care for the soil that's then going to be, which is the real key to a resilient system. And so whenever I'm thinking about regenerative agriculture, I'm always thinking about making sure that those systems are in direct response to some of these degenerative agricultural processes. And that's sort of where a lot of my critique of regenerative agriculture comes from as well, which is the next slide. So when I'm also thinking about these regenerative agricultural systems in opposition to degenerative processes, one of the largest shortcomings I find within the regenerative agricultural systems is the ability to operate in the intersections. And what I mean by that is the ability to interrogate race, class, gender, and how that's playing a role in this larger food system. Because it's important to acknowledge that doing work towards dismantling systems of oppression is climate action. And that is food justice, it's climate justice. Having the ability to step back and really be able to think consciously about your food choices is a massive privilege. And so we really need to be thinking about how we're developing these systems to be more inclusive of everybody, and how are we dismantling a lot of those barriers in order to provide those opportunities, provide really provide the agency to make those choices, and to have all voices present at the table of these conversations. And one of my other large sort of critiques of regenerative agricultural systems is that from what I've seen of it and what I've understood, and like from working within the sustainable ag, sort of regenerative ag, agroecology realm, is that it's very much so a Western agricultural approach to what I see as like a Western agricultural challenge, which is a lot of the industrialization of agriculture and the industrialization of agriculture, mass industrialization of agriculture. Also acknowledging that, like, when we're looking at the global scale, we have like 70% of the population is fed by peasant agricultural systems, or like small landholders of less than 2 hectares, roughly 4 acres. And they're operating on 25% of the land. And I'll get to some of that peasant agriculture a little bit later when I'm talking about agroecology. But another challenge I have with regenerative agriculture is that, for me, a lot of these systems and processes, it feels like a co-optation and a rebranding of traditional wisdom, knowledge, experience, narratives, and it's academizing it. And not that there's anything wrong with that. Like, agroecology is sort of a marriage of academy and other forms of knowing, and other forms of other epistemologies and other ontologies. But basically, my big critique of regenerative agriculture is that I'm seeing it still operating within that same settler colonial framework. That's sort of how I've seen in more recent years the agriculture expanding to the point where we're at right now, in terms of the industrialization. And so some of the questions that I sort of have for everyone to start thinking about is, how are we developing these systems and strategies that are interrogating and dismantling some of these existing systems of oppression, rather than working within those frameworks and within those same ideologies that were really the cause of this initial, or one of the causes of this climate crisis we're dealing with right now. And also really interrogating how is regenerative agriculture interrogating inequities, and who is present in these dialogues and who's not present in the dialogues. I think that's another really important aspect that we need to be thinking about, especially when we start thinking about who is actually growing the food, who are the food producers in the world. And that sort of draws back to the 70% of our food, and that's from Food Ag Organization, the 2014 survey. But that 70% of the food is being processed and produced by 25% of the land, and by farmers who are operating on less than 4 acres or 2 hectares. And so one of the things that I've sort of seen is sort of a counter narrative or another means of moving away from this idea of regenerative towards a dialogue of agroecology. And agroecology, the way I best understand it is, one, it's a word and it's a concept that really defies being defined. It's rooted so deeply in personal narratives and lived experiences and in space and in time. All these different aspects come to play. And so one of the first things that I always think of when someone asks me, like, what does agroecology mean? My first question is, well, to who? And so when we think of agroecology, we can start thinking of it in these three different waves. And the first wave was the very simple applying ecology to agriculture. And the second wave is when you start engaging with the larger food system. And that's when you start entering into the conversation, these dialogues of justice, racism, classism, economic justice. And you start understanding, like, this concept is starting to get a lot larger. It's starting to become a lot more dynamic of a conversation and a dialogue. And the third wave is including various and diverse epistemologies and ontologies. And so it's acknowledging and it's interrogating, like, who is the expert in all of these conversations. And it's looking at that sort of marriage of academia, indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, lived experience, narratives, and sort of, I always like to think of it as this difference between knowledge and wisdom, and it's incorporating both of those into the conversation as equally important. And another really important aspect of agroecology is that it's a science and a practice and a social movement. And when we're reaching those three simultaneously, that's when we're creating a real chance to be creating transformation in both an agricultural scale, but also as a society and a food system in general. I'm going to keep moving, so I'm not going to be in the sun all the time here. And so another thing that when I think of local food, because agroecology I see as a means and a strategy towards food sovereignty. And I think when we talk about the local food system, it's another question of, like, who is able to participate, who has the resources to participate in a local food system. When so much of, like, going through to some of my history working, it's like working with people experiencing homelessness and with populations that have, like, really large barriers to access to basic needs. And so if you're not able to access your basic needs, I'm not sure if folks are familiar with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but you can't really be starting to think critically about these larger systems if what you're worried about is your next meal, or you're, like, where you're finding shelter. And so it's important to note and understand that local food is a privilege, and really analyze who is able to participate in the local food movement and who is not. And that's sort of what I'm talking about a lot when I'm saying the need to be working in these intersections, the need to be working in like increasing access to food, or like breaking down some of these barriers. That is climate action. It's providing some of these basic needs so that you can actually start interrogating some of these larger issues, or have, like, the time and space to be able to interrogate some of these larger issues. Not to say that also, like, racism, classism, these are really large issues. I don't want to demean that in what I'm talking about here, but instead of focusing on local food, sort of this, like, food security model, I always try to look at it as a food sovereignty. And food sovereignty, my favorite quote, my favorite definition of it is from La Via Campesina, The Peasant's Way, the largest grassroots organization in the world. and they have a whole massive definition of food sovereignty that's very, very comprehensive. And so food sovereignty basically is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. So that's a quote from Raj Patel. And basically what it's talking about is the reclaiming of the food system. It's flipping who has the power of, who has that decision-making power behind what's happening with our food, and who is invited to the table in these discussions. It's also important to note that when we're talking about a food sovereignty sort of design or food sovereignty goal, it's supposed to be an alternative to some of the neoliberal policies, and that's how it was originally brought up, was as an alternative to neoliberal policies. And I just want to make sure I'm not going to go over time here, and I'm just about there, so I have one more slide and then it's perfect timing. And I also want to invite, because like these are huge topics that it's hard to really go in depth. So I want to invite folks to really go further into learning more about agroecology, learning more about food sovereignty, and sort of some of the takeaways that I was hoping to get away with this is, in order to make real strides in addressing the climate crisis, just that need to be thinking creatively and critically about how we're dismantling these systems and creating these spaces of agency, so that the solution is more of a prefigurative solution, where we're resembling the future that we actually want to see, and we have everybody at the table, and the folks who are most affected by the climate crisis are some of the people who are in that decision-making process and have a voice and have power in that space. And often this means thinking of systems that don't follow the colonial or settler colonial framework. And it's looking at a lot more radical responses, or a lot more creative actions, and understanding that these struggles are one and the same. I just want to leave it with this one quote from actually an old UW professor who worked with one of my really close friends, Megan Bang. And she said this years ago: rather than making efforts to signal we are pursuing equity, we must wholly refuse to set inequitable tables. Once marginalized voices are already at the table, we can stop signaling and start working together. Yeah, I guess I'll just leave it with that. I think that's a really powerful quote, and really sort of sums up a lot of what I was trying to get at, talking about the social aspect of some of these agricultural systems.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anthony. It's a very important topic that not enough people really discuss a lot of times, on the food justice side of things. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Nick Bond. He is the Washington State climatologist and a principal research scientist at UW. Nick, do you want to?
Yeah, good afternoon. And you should be seeing my screen here. I'll make it. And you should be seeing a ski hill that's bare of snow, right? This is a recent nightmarish winter, record low snowpack, and record high temperatures in the Pacific Northwest, kind of a wake-up call for the climate community. What I'm going to do here in the next few minutes is just kind of put that a little bit into a historical context, and in the context of what our climate models are suggesting is liable to happen in future decades, and all from the lens of agriculture, that kind of perspective. So here's a whirlwind tour. Now, going back to that that terrible year of 2015, it was definitely impactful on agriculture in Washington State, especially those that non-irrigated farms. Wheat in particular, yields were down like 22%. There were huge losses there in pastures and other kind of dry land agriculture. The overall income to the growers that year was at least 10% lower than it otherwise would have been, just because of what the climate delivered, and in particular the lack of water. With regards to what's happening around here, this is a time series going back to 1950 for the months of June through August of the average temperatures in the climate division that encompasses many of the really high value agricultural regions of Washington State, including the Yakima Valley and Lower Columbia Basin. And you can see that the steady, the upward trend interspersed with warm and cooler years and so forth. And there's the disaster of 2015 near the end. That upward rise is even more pronounced in minimum temperatures, the nighttime temperatures. And that's in part because it's getting more humid here. This is a time series, again, back to 1950 of just the low level of humidity in the state. And that is just how sticky the air is. It's still nothing like, the deep south of the US in summer where it's so insufferable, but it is getting more moist here. Not more precipitation, but humidities are going up. And part and parcel with that is nighttime temperatures, especially, are going up. And so just like I said here, taking more of an annual average, and the climate community in the West kind of thinks of water years that start on October 1st and then go through the following summer. And here, if you look at a long time series for the whole Northwest going back to the 1890s, not really much of a trend in overall precipitation here, but as you'll see in a minute, there's some nuances here that are really important. Okay, what are the climate models suggesting? On the left, the two panels show what the temperatures are forecast by the climate models that we have as a group. The upper panel is for the winter months, November through March. The lower one is for the summer months, June through August. And red means hotter than it is now. And this difference is basically between the middle of this century compared to the end of the 20th century. So we're talking about 3 degrees C, 5 degrees Fahrenheit of warming over that period. On the right is the precipitation of predictions from these models. And here I could keep coming back to water. Water is life. Mark Twain supposedly said, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting over. And there are all kinds of water issues in the arid West. What the models are suggesting is that our winters are going to be wetter and our summers are going to be drier. There's a different scale on the two plots on the right, in that the the increase in precipitation in winter is greater than the decrease in summer. But what this suggests, and we're already seeing hints of this, that the Northwest and Washington State in particular will have even more of a Mediterranean climate into the future. Now, we, of course, can do something about that. And these this plot here shows individual model runs of temperature, modeled temperature in the Pacific Northwest. The red traces are if it's a kind of business as usual in terms of we continue to spew out greenhouse gases, more or less at the clip that we're doing it right now, while the blue traces, with the average being the kind of bright blue line, is if we really get our act together and start limiting those emissions and or sequestering carbon, as Professor Montgomery indicated. So we have some choice there, but the bottom line is it could get a lot warmer here if we don't do something about it. We're already seeing decreases in snowpack in many of our mountain locations. One size doesn't fit all, but this is representative of in the North Cascades. Just there were bad snow years in the past, and there are good ones like this year in recent decades. But overall, that snowpack that is a reservoir of water to get us through the dry summer, that's dwindling. And what that means for our rivers is, in some cases, is going to be quite profound. There are some rivers like the Chehalis River on the left that's pretty low elevation. It gets almost all of its precipitation in the form of rain during the wet fall and early winter. And so that's when all of its flow is. And with climate change, maybe that timing isn't going to change too much. But then there are other rivers, watersheds like the Yakima, which gets both rain and snow. And so it has right now, it gets a kind of a peak flows in the wet season. They go down a little bit, and then when the snow melts, it a larger peak in terms of the flow. And this is if there were no dams on it and so forth. With climate change, instead of snow during the winter months, there'll be a lot more rain, and so the timing of these flows is going to be different, with a lot more coming down the channel during the winter when you don't need it as much versus in the summer when we need it to irrigate our crops. So even though it's going to be wetter in winter here, there's going to be plenty of issues. And the idea, we need that water in the summer. And so in managing that system, you want to leave space in the reservoirs in case there's heavy rain, so you avoid winter floods. But if you're not holding that water, then you don't have it for the dry summer following. And so there's all kinds of tensions, you could say, in terms of balancing all the different stakeholders' needs and so forth here. And so not going to be, it's not easy now, and it's going to get even harder. All right, let's turn to agriculture. And here, want to make sure, it's not all doom and gloom. If you're growing alfalfa, a longer growing season, maybe get another cutting of your crop. What's not to like about that? Certain kinds of crops, CO2 may actually increase their productivity, not necessarily the nutritional content of them, and that's bigger, another story. But there are some benefits that may accrue to agriculture around here. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting here, and just a little tidbit, I can't resist showing it to you, is that for some kinds of plants, it turns out that they're at higher CO2 concentrations, their stomata, essentially their pores have to be as open, and so they don't lose as much water as they otherwise would, and so they can be more drought tolerant. Now, again, that one size doesn't fit all, but there are, I'm looking for some good news here too. But there are definitely some drawbacks, and a lot of our, the orchards, wine grapes, mini crops, and just, soil pests and that sort of thing. We're kind of adapted to enough winter chilling. And if that isn't happening, then there can really be problems with it. And then obviously in summer, as the temperatures go up, plants, just like humans, have risk of heat stress, and there's all kinds of other sorts of implications in terms of pests and other diseases. Well, one of the things we're seeing, another example here, just in milk production. The upper left plot shows where the cows are across the United States, and there's quite a bit of dairy farming here in the Pacific Northwest. And it turns out that there's well-documented decreases in yields when cows are too hot and when it's too hot and humid for the cows. And as the climate warms and humidifies, that's going to be an increasingly a problem, especially in the southern part of the country. Here, maybe a little bit closer to home, wine grapes, important to a lot of us. There's been some work that has shown that there's the areas across the West that are suitable for wine grapes from a climate point of view. Some of those in red here are presently suitable that may not be in the future. The blue places are where they may become suitable. They aren't right now. And in this paper, they said, oh, we could grow a lot more grapes in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. Some of those areas are occupied by orchards or forests that have other ecosystem benefits. And so, you know, it's not just as easy as saying, oh, we'll be able to move the vines up the hill or something. I'm just going to skip next couple of slides, just examples about, I guess I haven't skipped this one yet, about, you know, some of the pathogens that we're expecting to increase. And I want to get back to, you know, kind of an environmental justice idea that, you know, it's just not the mean temperatures going up, but it is the extreme events, and in particular heat waves. This is an example again from our poster child of 2015 of the hottest day of a heat wave at the end of June. You can see some temperatures here in the late afternoon, 111, 113 in places, really hot day. This is, and it was especially humid in the agricultural areas that were, that are irrigated. And so for the folks, the agricultural workers who are outside, they were being exposed to conditions that really are dangerous to human health. There's, and I kind of wonder, as the climate warms, are growers going to be willing to give their workers long enough breaks so that they can get through these kinds of conditions? And so I think that is something that, you know, we really have to give a lot of thought to, and basically there's going to have to be some accommodations made. So just my takeaway points here. We are already seeing slow warming, especially in the nighttime temperatures, and there's a variability from year to year, but the trends are unmistakable. Our climate models, and we're not absolutely 100% sure of this, but there's a strong indication that we'll have wetter winters and drier summers. And so we may have enough water, but it's all about the timing and whether we can hang on to that during the winter to get through that dry season. And then finally, it's not like they are going to ignore this. The agricultural community will have to adapt. And in particular, perhaps some of the sort of things that David was talking about, some of the changes in practices can make them more resilient to our future climate. And with that, I appreciate your attention, and let's have a discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. For the next part of our talk and discussion today, we're going to open this up to a Q&A for our speakers. And so we have the chat. If you can put your questions or comments for our speakers in the chat, Alexa and I can ask them and hopefully get you answers to your questions. Thereafter, we're going to do breakout rooms to let you have discussion with other participants and some of the speakers, as well as us. And then we'll have our exit survey at the end of that point. So please, we'll give a minute or two here to put your questions in the chat.
While we're waiting on that, I have a question for really everyone, but I think specifically Nick. I was wondering if we are seeing any impacts from forest fires that we've been seeing in the past few years, and what those implications might be.
Yeah, good question. And in particular, I assume you're kind of direct impacts on agriculture. And in particular, we've in Oregon last September was when there's some really severe fires. And I know that some very high value wine grapes were basically ruined by what's called smoke taint. That was, that's been talked about in past years. And in some cases, it didn't turn out to be as bad as feared, but I know that there were some losses due to that. And then also, water systems were really impacted. There were plenty of pumping stations and other sort of things that were just taken out by the fires. And so it wasn't just the smoke itself, but the actual fires, their effect on the infrastructure and so forth. And certainly some of the, farming communities, I forget the name of the one that basically burned up completely in Eastern Washington last summer, but maybe somebody recalls the name of that. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Okay, first question looks like it's for Anthony. Are there US government policies that support regenerative agriculture? And what is stopping the government from implementing this as a common practice?
There actually, I guess there's a short answer and a long one. The short one is I know it was proposed in, so there actually are like grants that you can be going for that that are specifically for, they call it more like carbon smart farming. There's tons of grants you can be going for that. They have like really amazing programs down in California around carbon smart agriculture is actually what they call it. Yes, there's lots of grants and government funding that you can be going for in that aspect. There's also it's waiting to see how it's going to be rolled out, but it was pretty soon after Biden and Vilsack took office. There was a whole proposal to be trying to increase some of the funding available for a lot more of these, what they're calling like carbon smart agriculture, like agricultural processes that are trying to draw down more carbon into the soil. So there are definitely moves in that. What was the other question?
What is stopping the government from implementing this as a common practice?
I have like my thoughts about that, and I think it's like where the money is lying. Yeah, it's I think it's just all following where that money, following the dollar. Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about how our farming system is run. I think the entire subsidy system that we have is like backwards. The entire like organic policy and practices that you have to prove and get certified that you're not using anything, and have like all of these incurring costs that are on top of that, is very frustrating. But yeah, it's a lot in like the interest groups, a lot of where the money is really at. And thinking of that in like the global scale, because a lot of our agriculture is so much more export oriented rather than really focused on providing food for us. It's a lot of looking at like the commodity crops that are growing.
The last chapter of Growing a Revolution talks extensively about that question.
Excellent. I'll have to recommend your book in our email up then too.
We will also put that in the chat. I have one question for David. So this person would like to hear more about how increasing soil organic matter can reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Oh, well, because first of all, the practices that you would use to actually build soil carbon tend to be some that result in fewer emissions. So when you go to no-till farming, you take, say, a conventional farm and convert it to no-till, and you do it in ways that are not dependent on glyphosate, which again is a whole nother issue that I talk about in Growing a Revolution. But if you're to do that, you end up driving your tractor across the field half as much as you did before. So you're basically burning less diesel. That's a direct reduction in emissions. You're also using less nitrogen-based fertilizer, and there's a huge fossil fuel footprint cost to using nitrogen fertilizer. So the degree to which you can get farmers off of it or greatly reduce it also reduces their direct emissions. So there's this wonderful sort of twofer, if you will, in terms of the practices that build soil organic matter, resulting in reduced agricultural emissions, but they also result in greater carbon sequestration in the soil or storage in the soil. So it's sort of both ways. It helps both ways.
Okay, next question is for any of the speakers, what are the things that those of us who don't farm or work in agriculture can do to start encouraging shifts towards these agricultural practices and policy and practice in which farms or people we support?
I think supporting farms whose practices you like is got to be top of the list. So look, finding places like 21 Acres and people who are doing work like they are in terms of transforming the way farming's done. Maybe the most direct thing an individual can do is vote with your food dollars and support the farmers that you really like. And that's something that Ann and I have started to do much more consciously in terms of realizing that the signals you receive in the typical grocery store aren't enough to tell you whether a farm is really regenerative or not, in the sense that Anthony was talking about it. The organic label doesn't always tell you that it's soil building, healthy farming. And that was the point of that one slide with Gabe Brown's organic neighbor. Brown is not an organic farmer. He would hit you if you, I've told him that I would refer to him as an organic-ish farmer, because he's basically weaned himself off of agrochemicals, but he just doesn't want to self-identify that way. And it's like, fine, okay. I like the way he's farming though, and he's built his soil up much better than his organic neighbors. What's the problem on the neighboring organic farm? They rely on tillage for weed control, and it limits the ability to restore organic matter to the soil. So there's nothing wrong with it. They're just not able to get as much improvement as he is by using a different philosophy. So I think the simplest thing would be to educate yourself on where your food is actually coming from and try and support regenerative farmers or farmers whose practices you prefer. And I'm sure that Tony and Nick probably have ideas on this as well, but that's my go-to answer, because I think it's so in our own power to think about how we're buying our food.
And we've got a list of local farms that have this with connection to 21 Acres that we'll send out to everyone at the end too.
Yeah, I'll just hop in and quickly just say that there's it's actually like a pretty recent initiative that went live last year, or last year, called Eat Local First. And it's collaboration with like Sustainable Connections, Tilth, and a whole bunch of different organizations. It's sort of specific to the west side of Washington, but it has they have like the most complete database. It like used to be Puget Sound Fresh, and they have it sort of connects you with all the local farmers. Yes, I will link that in the chat.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that, David, I think vote with your food basket or something like that. Well, vote at the ballot box too. And there are certainly policies that are, in terms of the whole subsidy of the industrial agricultural, dynasty, especially in the kind of central part of the United States. And is that really the way we want it? People don't realize, but the Great Plains gets a tremendous subsidy from the rest of the country in terms of basically farm support. There's a net flow of dollars from the coast to the heartland, and much of that has to do with subsidies of that sort. And so, is that something that we really want to have happen? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I'll stop there.
well, no, I think Nick, that's a really good point. And I think that one of the things we can forecast is that we will start seeing bigger changes in our national agricultural system when people outside of agricultural areas really start paying attention and caring about the policies that shape the way our food's grown and distributed.
Yeah, well said.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more question. This one's for Nick. Has there been data collected that reflects on the impact of the quarantine last year? For example, less cars driving the roads. Have we had, a quarantine in Washington State? Has that affected, food processes and then just carbon emissions as well?
Yeah, it has had a very modest effect on carbon emissions, and transportation, especially early in the pandemic, was really down. I did just some poking around myself looking at nitric oxide pollution in the Puget Sound Basin. You could see the decline past years, but yeah, I think it's been pretty modest, and it's not like the rise in greenhouse gas concentrations has flattened off or anything. It's still going up, and it's but I think what it does show is that we can accomplish things when we really have to. When you think about it from a social point of view, some of the accommodations that were made on because of the pandemic were huge ones. And so we can change. And I would say that, we don't have much of an excuse to not changing. And, obviously, I would hope it wouldn't be something like this that would cause change. But anyway, kind of a vague answer, but a great question.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I wish we had time for all the questions. There's a couple other really great ones, but we'll have to move forward. So next, we're going to put everyone in breakout discussion groups. There's going to be breakout rooms here in this Zoom session with questions to help you guide discussion. We'll send a broadcast message to the groups for you to have access to questions and speakers. If you can stick around, you can jump into the sessions and speak with participants directly that way too. And then afterwards, we'll come back, share some of the ideas and concepts people have come up with, and then have an exit poll similar to the entry poll you did when you registered to see how learning has increased since you've been in this session. Okay, so Alexa, do you have the breakout rooms ready to go? Okay, so we're going to set that up. Thank you all for participating, and we'll be jumping in breakout rooms too.
And then we'll come back after that, so stay tuned. Okay, here we go. We should be going right now.
Okay, and then Alexa, are you going to broadcast the message or shall I?
Why
Oh,
don't
and pause recording.
Oh yes, pause recording. Okay, we've got a couple more people still finishing up their conversation, so we'll give them about 10 more seconds and then we'll get started on wrapping up this event. All right.
Okay, so thank you all. Hopefully the breakout rooms were very interesting. You hopefully got to share some ideas and learn some things. We'd love to have you all share some of the things you learned or discussed in the chat, and then we can share them out that way. We'll put together a sheet by email to send out to all registered participants afterwards to give you further resources for learning, ideas of local farms and different elements of things that were discussed in the 3 presentations. We also have a recording of this so you can watch this at home or share it with others later too. So we'll give you a moment or two. Please, yeah, write something in the chat of some of the highlights of things you learned in this discussion.
I've got one that says, I had mentioned the regenerative organic certified program in our breakout group, and Anthony had also mentioned it, and I will share that link in the chat right now. There you go. Thank you for that.
Okay, I have one thing. One of the things the group talked about was the financial limitations of making some of these personal choices. Absolutely right. This is an accessibility and equity issue in a sense, right? But the benefits of trying to make changes in communities and smaller groups. This is something that can be done with like your community gardens, talking to neighbors, growing some of your own food this way, to find other ways besides going to often the more expensive organic food or locally produced food. I mean, there's definitely challenges this way. It's a very important point of finding alternative ways to support this, and not stressing out too much if you just have to sometimes, right? I mean, we're not going to shame you for having to go to the normal grocery stores. Another group talked about lawns to lettuce and agricultural resilience programs. So that's actually one I haven't heard about. We'll look it up and share that out later too.
I'm getting that link right now. Okay, I found out that composting can contribute only a portion of soil regeneration efforts, and that there are biological and chemical reasons for this. Yes, that is a good point. And not everyone has access to be able to compost, right? Because maybe you live in an apartment, or I know the residence dorms on campus do not allow for composting at this time. Hopefully that will change when we have our new dorms, but that might not be an option. And you know what, that's okay. We try to meet people where they're at with sustainability based on, accessibility and ability and finances and all of it. We chatted about the importance of living out your values and the ripple effect that can occur from that. We also chatted about the physical, emotional connection of being in direct contact with the soil. It's healthy for us. We spoke about access and challenges of eating low carbon when you live alone and are on a limited income. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, right now I'm growing some plant starts for my garden, and that's one way that I'm trying to offset some of the cost of, produce. And that way I'm also reducing the amount of food waste that I have, because I can just go out, pick, and then eat it right then, instead of buying too much at the store potentially and then not being able to eat all of it. Any last thoughts? Sounds like you had some great conversations. We talked about how mind-blowing it is that folks are now growing kelp to feed cows, and that significantly reduces cattle methane emissions. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so one of the things we always like to do with the climate dialogue is show an exit poll. So we're going to open a poll now with basically the same questions you were asked when you registered, and then we'll show a comparison of learning and more knowledge of before and after the event. So let me open this poll.
I did it.
You should all see it.
We'll give you about a minute to answer.
Have about 15 seconds left if you're still just putting in your submission.
Awesome. Okay. Do you want to share the entry results first, Stefan?
Yep. So here are the, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so here are the entry results. For the first question, right, please indicate the level of your understanding of the anticipated impacts of climate change on food systems in the Pacific Northwest. It was at about 63% for high, or sorry, 7% for high, 63% for moderate, and 29% for low. This now went up to 64% to high and 36% moderate with 0% low. So people have gained a lot more understanding about your impacts of climate change on food in the area. Number 2 was indicating your understanding of how your food choices impact climate. The high was only 30% now, and in the exit poll, it's now 79%. So you definitely learned a lot more about your food choices that way. Question number 3 was, please indicate your level of understanding of what you can do as an individual to reduce the impacts of your food choices on climate change. Let me move Alexa's face, sorry, sharing. The high was 38% before in the previous one, and now it's at 57% for the exit poll. So you all learned quite a bit that way. And then in the last question, how, in your opinion, how important is it to address food sustainability and climate change issues? Before was 61% extremely important, and now it's 86% extremely important. So you all have learned quite a bit, I feel, on climate change and food choices.
Awesome.
Okay, so thank you all to our speakers, to all you participants from all the different colleges and universities in the community for attending. Please keep remembering to learn and talk about climate change. And of course, please vote, as we said, right? Voting both with your dollar and with actual voting legislatively does make a difference. Please help people with food security and try and make better choices where you can. We'll be sending out a what's next resource document for actions past this event with some of the resources and things about the farms with a recording of this event as well. So please be on the lookout for that, and we'll be hosting another climate dialogue likely in the fall. Also, just a reminder, if you're on the UW Bothell and Cascadia College campus, please do check out the community reads this quarter. It's on environmental food impacts and climate change, so it's a great way to continue the discussion and talk with others about this issue right now.
We also have a campus farm and food forest on campus to try to bring food that is healthy, sustainable, and accessible to all of our students, staff, and faculty. So please visit that and pick as well. And then I also have the Canvas page for community reads that I just put in the chat. So feel free to visit. And I've heard that there are some awesome readings and viewings for community reads this quarter. Thank you all so much.